call came from Hollywood saying they want you to come out right away to replace the father in Seinfeld. I said, I can't do it. I won't do it. We sat down, read the lines, and I didn't think the lines were so funny, and I started changing lines, and people looked at me like, you're crazy, you're doing this for NBC. And I realized after a few rehearsals that I too would be leaving that show very quickly because something was happening.
It was 1993, and NBC had a massive problem with its flagship show that nobody wanted to admit. Seinfeld was technically a hit, but the energy was stalling because George Costanza's father was, quite frankly, too nice. Then Jerry Stiller walked into the audition and staged a silent rebellion that changed television history. He completely ignored the director's notes to be timid and instead unleashed a frantic, screaming energy that saved the show from the polite parent trap. But wait, it actually gets weirder. The erasure of John Randolph. To understand how Seinfeld actually became the show we obsess over today, we have to look at the footage that was essentially sent to a digital incinerator. Back in Season 4, specifically in an episode titled The Handicap Spot, we met Frank Costanza for the first time. But if you were watching it live in May of 1993, the man on your screen wasn't the red-faced, screaming ball of neurotic energy we know as Jerry Stiller. Instead, audiences saw John Randolph. Now, according to his obituary in the New York Times, Randolph was a powerhouse of an actor who won a Tony Award and had been a fixture on stage and screen for over 50 years. He was a veteran, he was respected, and he was, quite frankly, a very normal dad. Here's the thing about that original performance. John Randolph played Frank Costanza as a calm, sensible, and relatively patient man. He looked like the kind of father who would give you solid advice about your 401k or help you move a couch without complaining. But Larry David, the co-creator and the architect of the show's dark DNA, watched the dailies and realized they had a massive structural problem. If George's father were a sane, rational person, then George's entire personality wouldn't make sense. If your dad is a nice guy, then your constant lying, your extreme social anxiety, and your general misery just make you look like a jerk who's making bad choices. But if your dad is a ticking time bomb of irrational rage, then your neurosis isn't a choice anymore. It's a survival mechanism. It's trauma. Now here's where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit brutal. Larry David became so obsessed with this realization that he didn't just decide to recast the role for future episodes. He decided to go back and literally scrub John Randolph from the history of the show. This is what insiders call the syndication scrub. Years later, once Jerry Stiller had successfully redefined the character, Larry David spent thousands of dollars to bring the entire cast back to the original sets. They refilmed every single one of John Randolph's scenes from that Season 4 episode with Jerry Stiller, just so that when the show went into reruns, the original Frank would effectively cease to exist. Think about that for a second. You're a veteran actor with a lifetime of accolades, and you're being systematically deleted from the most popular sitcom in the world because you were too sensible. It sounds like something out of a George Orwell novel, but in the world of high-stakes television, it was a mechanical necessity. Larry David was chasing a very specific dark sitcom tone where nobody learns anything and nobody is happy. He needed the Costanza household to feel like a high-pressure cooker. According to stories shared in Esquire by the cast, the original vibe with Randolph felt too much like a standard 1980s sitcom, and Seinfeld was trying to kill that entire genre. They needed someone who could make a simple conversation about a silver dollar feel like the start of a domestic war. But wait, it gets weirder. When they finally decided to pull the trigger on the recast, Jerry Stiller wasn't even interested. He had a successful career with his wife, Ann Mira, and he was basically retired from the auditioning for sitcoms phase of his life. When he eventually showed up for the audition, he was frustrated. He didn't want to be there, and he definitely didn't want to play the character the way they told him to. The directors and Larry David were still stuck on this idea of Frank being low energy and henpecked by Estelle. They wanted him to be the quiet victim of a loud wife. Stiller sat there for 3 days of rehearsals trying to be the quiet, timid version of Frank, and he hated it. He felt like he was failing. And more importantly, he felt like the character was boring. On the 4th day, during a dress rehearsal, he decided he'd had enough. He figured he was going to get fired anyway, so he might as well go out on his own terms. When Estelle Harris, who played George's mother, started screaming at him in a scene, Stiller didn't cower. He didn't play the timid husband. He stood up and screamed back at the top of his lungs, "Get off my back!" The entire set went dead silent. Larry David stared at him from the darkness of the studio, and then Larry started laughing. He realized that this silent rebellion from a veteran actor who didn't care about the rules had just unlocked the final piece of the Seinfeld puzzle. It wasn't about being nice or being a victim. It was about mutual, explosive combat. When Jerry Stiller finally walked into that audition, he didn't want the job. And he definitely didn't want to follow the directions. But he ended up creating one of the most iconic characters in the history of the medium. The most bizarre part wasn't that they replaced the actor. It was that they tried to pretend the first one never happened. And as Stiller began to realize the power of this new angry version of Frank, he started to take the character to places the writers hadn't even imagined. This wasn't just acting anymore. It was a veteran performer reclaiming his voice by being as difficult as humanly possible. The audition rebellion. When Jerry Stiller walked onto the set of Seinfeld for the first time in 1993, he wasn't looking to create a television legend. He was actually looking for a way out. He had been out of the sitcom game for a while, and the initial directions he received from the writers were, in his own words, death. Larry David and the directing team had a very specific vision for Frank Costanza, and it was a vision that almost killed the character before he ever got a chance to yell about Festivus. According to an archival interview with the Television Academy's Foundation, Stiller was explicitly told to play Frank as a passive, subservient man who wore a cap and cowered whenever his wife, Estelle, raised her voice. Think about that for a second. The Frank Costanza we know, the man who once screamed, "Serenity now," until his veins nearly popped, was originally supposed to be a quiet, henpecked husband who spent his scenes shrugging and taking verbal abuse. Stiller spent the first 2 days of rehearsals trying to make this work. He put on the cap, he lowered his head, and he spoke his lines with the defeated tone of a man who had completely given up on life. But as the hours dragged on, Stiller realized that the character was a black hole of energy. He felt like he was playing a prop rather than a person. And more importantly, he felt like the comedy was just evaporating every time he opened his mouth. Now here is where it gets interesting. Stiller was so convinced he was doing a terrible job that he assumed he'd be fired by the end of the week. He was 70 years old. He had nothing to lose. And he was bored out of his mind. So, on the 3rd day of rehearsals, during a scene where Estelle Harris was supposed to berate him for some minor domestic failure, Stiller reached his breaking point. He decided that if he was going down, he was going down fighting. Instead of cowering when Estelle started her high-pitched yelling, Stiller suddenly straightened his back, looked her dead in the eye, and shrieked his response at the top of his lungs. He didn't just say the lines. He launched them like physical projectiles. The entire cast and crew froze. According to accounts from Vulture, Estelle Harris was so caught off guard that she actually jumped, but she didn't stop. She yelled back. Suddenly, what had been a one-sided lecture turned into a frantic, high-decibel tennis match of pure, unadulterated frustration. It was the birth of the explosive Frank. Larry David was sitting in the back of the darkened studio, and the reaction was immediate. He didn't just like it. He realized that his original passive idea had been entirely wrong. He saw that the comedy didn't come from George having one loud parent and one quiet parent. It came from the fact that George was the product of two people who were constantly at war with the world and each other. The rage that Stiller brought to the table wasn't just a performance choice. It was a creative survival tactic that gave the entire show a new sense of momentum. It's an uncomfortable truth for many writers to hear, but some of the greatest moments in television history weren't meticulously planned in a writer's room. They were acts of pure desperation by actors who were simply too tired or too bored to follow the rules anymore. Jerry Stiller's decision to scream was a rebellion against a script that felt flat, and in doing so, he accidentally rewrote the DNA of the show. He transformed Frank from a background character into a force of nature that George actually had to fear. Now imagine you're a director, and your actor just completely ignores everything you told them to do for 3 days. Would you have the guts to admit your original idea was garbage and let them run with it, or would you have fired them on the spot? Larry David's genius in that moment wasn't his writing. It was his ability to recognize that Stiller had found something much better than what was on the page. And get this, the screaming didn't just change Frank. It forced everyone else to level up. Jason Alexander, the actor who played George, realized he had to react to this new energy. If Frank was this volatile, then George's frantic lying and constant panic suddenly had a clear, hilarious origin story. Everything about the Costanza family dynamic clicked into place during that one afternoon in 1993. The screaming worked, and it worked so well that the passive Frank version of the character was immediately buried. But as the producers watched the new footage, they realized this explosive energy created a brand new problem. It made George's character entirely different, and the show had to figure out how to handle the fallout of having two Georges on screen at the same time. The psychology of serenity. If you really want to understand the madness of Frank Costanza, you have to look at the phrase that defined a decade of televised frustration. Serenity now. On the surface, it was just another ridiculous catchphrase from a show that excelled at making the mundane feel monumental. But when Jerry Stiller shouted those two words at the ceiling, while his face turned a shade of purple that probably worried the on-set medics, he wasn't just performing a bit. He was actually dismantling the entire self-help culture of the 1990s in a single breath. Here's the thing about that era. The 90s were absolutely obsessed with the New Age movement, with everyone from corporate executives to suburban parents trying to find inner peace through mantras and mindfulness. It was supposed to be about calm, quiet reflection. But in the hands of Frank Costanza, serenity wasn't a state of mind. It was a demand. He didn't achieve peace. He tried to bully the universe into giving it to him. According to an archival tribute in Rolling Stone, Stiller's brilliance was in taking this Zen concept and weaponizing it. He transformed a peaceful suggestion into a frantic, high-decibel scream, which perfectly captured the absurdity of trying to suppress a lifetime of rage with a catchy slogan. Now, here is where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit controversial on the set. If you watch the old episodes closely, you'll notice that Frank Costanza has this very specific, disjointed way of speaking. He'll be in the middle of a sentence, and then suddenly, he just stops. He'll look up at the ceiling or squint his eyes, like he's trying to remember a name from 40 years ago, and then he'll finish the thought with a completely different energy. This became known as the acting pause. For years, people wondered if this was a sophisticated creative choice. Did Jerry Stiller actually forget his lines, or was he playing the most sophisticated game of character immersion in sitcom history? Well, the truth is a mix of both. According to reports from The Hollywood Reporter, Stiller was often genuinely struggling to remember the specific, fast-paced dialogue that the writers were constantly tweaking. But instead of breaking character or asking for a line, he leaned into the silence. He turned his own confusion into Frank's confusion. He made it look like Frank was literally searching the corridors of his own fractured mind for the right word. While this delighted the audience and added a layer of realism that most sitcoms lacked, it actually drove his co-stars a bit crazy. Jason Alexander, who played George, has spoken about how frustrating those pauses could be in the moment. Sitcom acting is usually about a very fast, rhythmic back and forth, like a jazz performance. When Stiller would stop for 5 seconds in the middle of a scene, the rhythm would die. But when the producers watched the tapes, they realized that those pauses were the funniest parts of the episode. It made Frank feel unpredictable. It made him feel like a real person who was actually struggling with the weight of his own thoughts. Think about that for a second. We're laughing at a man who is clearly on the edge of a total psychological breakdown. And that brings us to a pretty uncomfortable truth. While Frank Costanza's mental health struggles were hilarious to audiences, they actually represented a very real generational trauma. Frank was part of that post-war generation that was told to keep everything inside, to work hard, and to never show weakness. When you take that kind of repression and add the stresses of 1990s suburban life, Serenity now isn't just a joke. It's a cry for help from a man who has no other tools to deal with his world. And get this, his physical comedy was just as intentional as his verbal pauses. Stiller had this way of moving his body, this stiff, awkward gait, that made him look like he was constantly wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too small. He wasn't just a man, he was a pressurized vessel. Every time he raised his arms or shook his head, it felt like something was about to snap. He used his entire physical presence to mock the idea that anyone could truly be at peace in a world as chaotic as the one Larry David had built. There's a specific kind of genius in taking your own professional struggles, like forgetting a line or being frustrated with a script, and turning them into a signature comedic beat that defines a character for 30 years. Stiller didn't just play Frank, he lived him through the imperfections of the performance. He proved that sometimes the wrong way to act is exactly what a show needs to find its soul. But while Frank was becoming a legend through his rage and his eccentricities, the holiday he invented during the show's later years was actually a real-life nightmare for one of the writers' families. The truth about Festivus. Most of us celebrate December 23rd by posting memes about aluminum poles or jokingly yelling at our friends about all the ways they've disappointed us over the last year. But here's the thing about Festivus. What we see as a quirky, brilliant piece of television writing was actually a deeply strange and somewhat unsettling reality for a family in Chappaqua, New York. According to an investigative piece by the Smithsonian Magazine, the holiday for the rest of us wasn't dreamed up in a sunny writer's room in Los Angeles. It was the invention of Dan O'Keefe, a senior editor at Reader's Digest and the father of Seinfeld writer Dan O'Keefe. Now here is where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit dark. In the show, Frank Costanza is the architect of the holiday, but in real life, the elder O'Keefe started Festivus in the 1960s as a way to celebrate the anniversary of his first date with his wife. But as the years went on, it morphed into something much more intense. There was no aluminum pole in the original version. Instead, the O'Keefe family would gather around a clock nailed inside a paper bag. To this day, Dan O'Keefe says he doesn't actually know what the clock in the bag signified because his father would never tell him. Think about that for a second. You're a kid, and every year your father forces you to participate in a ritual involving a bagged timepiece and a tape recorder, and he refuses to explain why. When the younger Dan O'Keefe became a writer for Seinfeld, he didn't even want to mention the holiday. He was actually embarrassed by it. He thought his family was just weird, and he wanted to keep that part of his life hidden. But his fellow writers eventually found out, and Larry David, being the connoisseur of social awkwardness that he is, insisted it be put into the show. This is where Jerry Stiller's genius changed everything. Stiller took this bizarre family trauma and played it with such deadly serious conviction that it transformed from a private nightmare into a global phenomenon. Jerry Stiller didn't play Frank Costanza as a man doing a funny bit. He played him as a man who truly believed that the commercialism of Christmas had destroyed the American soul. When he stood in that kitchen and announced the airing of grievances, he wasn't winking at the camera. He was a man who had finally found a way to discharge decades of built-up resentment. According to the New York Times, Stiller's performance was rooted in a very real understanding of the airing of grievances as a psychological tool. In the real O'Keefe household, the family would actually gather around a tape recorder and state their complaints about each other. For the show, they made it a dinner table confrontation, but the core idea remained. A forced session of brutal honesty that left everyone feeling slightly worse than they did before. And get this, the choice of the aluminum pole, the most iconic symbol of the holiday, was a deliberate creative decision to make the holiday feel even more barren and hostile. The writers wanted something that had absolutely no aesthetic value. No tinsel, no lights, just a cold, metallic stick in a stand. It was the perfect visual metaphor for Frank's worldview. It was a rejection of beauty, a rejection of warmth, and a total embrace of the feats of strength. Here is the uncomfortable truth that we often overlook while we're laughing at the feats of strength. For the real O'Keefe family, Festivus was a source of genuine fear and confusion. Dan O'Keefe has described the real holiday as a proletarian nightmare. It wasn't a fun, kitschy alternative to the holidays. It was a manifestation of his father's eccentricities and a constant reminder that their home life didn't follow the rules of the rest of the world. Stiller took that tragedy, that sense of being trapped in an irrational parent's world, and he made us all feel like we were part of the family. He took a joke and played it as a tragedy, which is exactly why it resonated with anyone who has ever had a difficult relationship with their father. Now, think about your own family traditions. Every family has that one thing they do that would look absolutely insane to an outsider. Do you think those traditions are what hold a family together, or are they just a way for the person in charge to air their own grievances? It's entirely possible that without Jerry Stiller, Festivus would have just been a one-off joke that people forgot by the next season. But because he played it with the intensity of a Shakespearean lead, he gave it a life of its own. He made us believe that an aluminum pole and a high-decibel argument were just as valid as a decorated tree and a carol. Stiller was making millions from these grievances by the end of the show's run, but his real-life legacy was actually tied to a woman who was never on the show, and a relationship that was far quieter and more stable than anything we saw in the Costanza household. Think about that for a second. The man who became the face of domestic chaos spent over 60 years in one of the most successful and loving marriages in show business. The contrast between the man and the character is precisely what made the performance so powerful. He knew exactly what he was subverting because he lived the opposite reality every single day. Stiller was making millions from these grievances, but his real-life legacy was tied to a woman who was never on the show: the syndication gold mine. By the time Seinfeld wrapped its legendary run, Jerry Stiller wasn't just a guest star who got lucky with a few funny lines. He had become a financial juggernaut in the world of television. But here's the thing that most people don't realize about his late career explosion. When he first appeared as Frank Costanza in 1993, Stiller was already 65 years old. He'd spent 5 decades in show business, mostly as part of the comedy duo Stiller and Miara with his wife. And while he was respected, he had never truly experienced the kind of solo, gravitational fame that comes with being a household name. Now, here is where it gets interesting from a business perspective. According to reports in Vanity Fair, Stiller's surge on Seinfeld didn't just earn him a paycheck, it fundamentally changed his market value. He became the most sought-after character actor in Hollywood. When Seinfeld ended in 1998, Kevin James and the producers of a new sitcom called The King of Queens knew they needed a secret weapon to make their show work. They didn't just want a dad figure, they wanted the specific, volcanic energy that only Stiller could provide. They offered him the role of Arthur Spooner, and the deal was so lucrative that it basically made him one of the wealthiest character actors in history. He went from being a semi-retired veteran to a man anchoring a new hit for another 9 seasons, collecting syndication checks from 2 of the biggest sitcoms of all time simultaneously. Think about that for a second. Most actors are lucky to have one iconic role in a lifetime. Jerry Stiller managed to find 2 back-to-back, and he did it all after the age of 65. But wait, it gets even better. In his final interviews, specifically one with The Hollywood Reporter, Stiller made a confession that was both hilarious and deeply honest. He admitted that he never really felt like he was acting when he played Frank Costanza. Instead, he said he was just finally letting out all the built-up frustration of a man who had been in the industry for 50 years without a massive solo hit. He wasn't reaching for a character. He was just tapping into 50 years of being told no, 50 years of bad auditions, and 50 years of waiting for his moment. It's an uncomfortable truth about Hollywood, but success is often less about your training and more about a single 5-second decision to stop being polite. If Jerry Stiller had walked into that rehearsal in 1993 and followed the director's notes to be quiet and subservient, he probably would have finished that one episode and drifted back into a quiet retirement. We have to wonder, would he even be remembered at all if he hadn't decided to start screaming at a woman named Estelle on a random Tuesday afternoon? And get this, even with all that wealth and the legendary status, Stiller remained incredibly grounded. He didn't move to a massive mansion in the hills. He stayed deeply connected to the New York comedy scene that raised him. He knew that the gold mine he'd stumbled into was a rare gift, and he treated every day on set like he was still that kid trying to prove himself. He took the airing of grievances and turned it into a professional empire, proving that sometimes being the loudest person in the room is the only way to make sure the world actually hears you. Here's the thing about the syndication gold mine. It wasn't just about the money for Stiller. It was about the validation. After decades of being the guy from that comedy duo, he was finally just Jerry Stiller. He had created a character that felt like a father to millions, even if he was the loudest father on the block. But as the cameras finally dimmed on his long career, the legacy he left behind wasn't just about the yelling or the money. It was about a much quieter, much deeper reality that he kept hidden from the public eye. He left behind a character that felt like a father to millions, even if he was the loudest father on the block. But here's the thing that really stays with you. For 60 years, Jerry Stiller was one half of a legendary comedy team with his wife, Ann Miara. They were the it couple of the Ed Sullivan era, building a career on sharp, observational wit. When Ann passed away in 2015, the world expected Jerry to finally go quiet. But instead, he used his final years to talk about her as the real architect of his success. He admitted that the internal confidence he needed to scream at the Seinfeld cameras came from the decades he spent being loved by a woman who actually thought he was enough. It's a rare Hollywood story where the loudest, angriest man on television was actually the most devoted, gentle partner off-screen. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a man who spent a lifetime practicing the art of partnership before he ever had to practice the art of Festivus. It's wild to think that the version of Seinfeld we all grew up with was almost entirely different. And it all came down to one man deciding to be difficult on a Tuesday afternoon. Jerry Stiller didn't just play a character. He essentially forced the show to rewrite its own history, literally scrubbing John Randolph's sensible performance from the records to make room for his iconic rage. It's a legacy of rebellion that changed television forever. What do you think about his story?